Now, learning Python would be no fun if you were to simply watch and observe what I do throughout this course. That's why we're going to get you set up with Python, as well as install a text editor that will allow you to write your code so that you can code along with me and experience the benefits of Python firsthand. It's only when you get stuck in and immerse yourself in the coding world when you will really start to understand how it works and how it can be used to its full potential. If you have Python 3 installed as well as a text editor, feel free to move on to the next video. If you haven't, continue watching and we'll have you set up in a few minutes. Now, whenever I get a new laptop or a PC and want to install Python, I usually opt for the same installation option every time, and this is Anaconda. This will not only install Python on your machine, but it will also come pre-installed with very useful packages that you will no doubt use in your coding journey. So rather than downloading Python and then installing common packages separately, you can install Anaconda, which comes pre-shipped with some very useful stuff. One of these things being Jupyter Notebook, which we will be predominantly using in this course to learn the Python language. So if this route sounds right for you, then all you need to do is type www.anaconda.com into a web browser, and this will take you to the Anaconda homepage. Right in the middle, you will see the ability to download Anaconda for Windows. So if you are operating a Windows machine, click the green button. Otherwise, you can select the little apple icon for Mac downloads or the penguin icon for Linux downloads. Seeing as I'm using a Windows machine, I will simply click on the green button. And when I do this, the Anaconda graphical installer will start downloading instantly. If you've selected Mac, just download the 64-bit graphical installer, or if you've selected Linux, download the 64-bit installer for Linux, and your download will start respectively. Now this will take some time to run, so take yourself off, make a coffee or tea, and it should be done when you're back. Rather than you sitting and waiting for this to download on my side, I will fast forward this part to save time. Now once done, open the file that was downloaded, and you'll be presented with the Anaconda setup wizard like so. Now just like most installations, you can hit next to continue, and you need to agree to the license agreement. So give this a read if you wish, but in short, to use this distribution, you need to agree to it. Next, you can select Just Me for the installation type, and then hit next. You will then be asked to choose an installation location. Now I'm happy with the default destination folder that is appearing here in my C drive and users, then Tom, but if you would like to change your location, then you have the ability to browse and select your location accordingly. You will then be presented with some advanced options, but for this I would recommend selecting Register Anaconda 3 as my default Python 3.9 and then simply hit Install. When you do this, it will take a few minutes to perform the installation. Now once the installation has complete, you can hit next, and then you are presented with some helpful tips and resources to get you started. But at this point, you are done. So you can click finish and you will now have Python installed on your machine. It's that easy. Now not only will you have Python installed on your machine, but you will also have what is known as Jupyter Notebook, which we'll introduce more in a minute, but let's open this up to see that it's installed everything correctly. So in your search bar, type Anaconda, and this will bring up the Anaconda prompt, which is what you're trying to find. Select this, and you will then be presented with a blank screen and a base location, which would coincide with where Anaconda was installed if you didn't start changing the location of installation. Now at this point, just type Jupyter Notebook and then hit Return. This will open up a web browser and you are now inside Jupyter. Welcome. To start a new notebook, click on New on the right hand side here, and then select Python 3, and you'll be taken to a blank Jupyter Notebook where we can now write code. Now if Python was installed correctly, we should be able to write some code and for the code to then be interpreted and run correctly. So to prove this, I can quickly type A equals 1, then I can put B equals 2, and then I can press Shift Enter to run this code cell. When I now type A plus B and then press Shift and Enter, we get 3 returned to the screen, which tells me we are set up correctly. Don't worry about what this code represents for now and what we've just typed our code into. This will all be explained in upcoming videos. As of now, this just tells us we are set up and ready to go. Now there will be times when you want to write your code outside of Jupyter Notebook. And in this course, we do have projects in which we code outside of Jupyter Notebook. So the next thing you'll need is a text editor or an integrated development environment in which you can write some code. Now my personal favourite at the moment is Visual Studio Code, but there are many other options such as PyCharm, Sublime Text, Atom, Notepad++, and a whole lot more. Now the debate over which is the best is forever ongoing, but you should come to find one you enjoy using and just go with that. At the end of the day, it's used to write code and they more or less achieve the same thing, albeit with some plugins that can make the experience of writing and creating code files a little easier. Now downloading an integrated development environment is no harder than Googling your IDE of choice. So let's for example say we want to download Visual Studio Code. So if I type Visual Studio Code into a web browser, here we are then presented with the Visual Studio Code's website. And I can see here we have a download option. So if I click this, I can then select my operating system. In my case it's a Windows machine, but choose yours respectively. When I do this, Visual Studio Code user setup starts downloading. And when it's complete, I'm able to open the file. When I do this, in a very similar way to Anaconda, I get a license agreement for which I need to accept. So I can click on accept and then next. I can then select the destination of the installation, so I'll leave this as the default path that appears in this window. I can then click next. I can then select a start menu folder, so I'll just click next on this menu. I can then choose some additional tasks, but I'll leave it selecting register code as an editor for supported file types, as well as adding Visual Studio Code to path. I can then hit next. This will then install Visual Studio Code, and once it's complete, Visual Studio Code will then automatically open. You are now set up with the ability to write code in files within Visual Studio Code. So if I create a new text file and select Python as my language of choice, I can now start typing code and then we can save the file and run it accordingly. But more on this later. For now, you are set up with Python, you are set up with Jupyter Notebook, and you are set up with an integrated development environment if you've chosen Visual Studio Code. So if you have managed to get all of the above installed, you should have everything you need to start coding along with me and learning the wonderful language of Python. If you have run into any issues with the installation, please feel free to reach out to me in a personal message and we'll try to address your issue and get you set up as quickly as possible. With the installation out of the way, next up we'll take a look at some command line basics. So I'll see you in the next video. Now during the course, we'll be using something called Jupyter Notebook extensively. Not only is it where we'll be writing our code and learning the ins and outs of Python, but it's also where we will see and observe the output of our code to ascertain whether it's working correctly or not. If you are already familiar with Jupyter Notebook and want to skip ahead to the main content, feel free to do so. This video is for those who want to install and learn how to use Jupyter, as well as pick up a few shortcut tips when working in a notebook. So what is Jupyter Notebook? Well, Jupyter Notebook is an open source web application that can be used to create documents that contain live code. But not only can you write code in notebooks, You can also include equations, visualizations to observe your output, and narrative text, which can help explain to users what each section of your notebook is doing. Now, once you've created a notebook, sharing it with your intended audience is easy, and I'll show you how you can do this. Now, a little interesting fact for you is that the name Jupyter comes from the main languages that it supports, and these being Julia, Python, and R. Now, Jupyter comes with what is known as the IPython kernel, which allows you to write your programs in Python. But there are actually over 100 other kernels that you can also use. So if you're keen on learning other programming languages, utilizing a Jupyter notebook would be a great place to do so. So with respect to installation, well, firstly, if you've previously installed Python from their website, Jupyter Notebook is not included. So if you want to use it, you'll need to install it. And to install it, providing you are using Python 3, you can use a handy tool that comes with Python called pip. So in your command line, you can write something like pip install Jupyter, and then Jupyter will be installed. Now for me personally, whenever I install Python on a machine, I use the Anaconda distribution. And why do I do this? Well, Anaconda comes with many pre-installed libraries that are commonly used in data science, and this includes Jupyter Notebook. So you don't actually need to do anything other than install Anaconda itself. Very simple. Okay, so if you followed along with my installation of Python utilizing Anaconda, we're ready to dive in. So a good start would be to learn how to open Jupyter Notebook. All you need to do is open up your terminal application or command prompt and go to a folder of choice. So for example, if I utilize my Anaconda prompt, I can navigate to a folder destination of choice, just like we saw in the last video. So let's say I enter a folder that I've set up called Python. I can type cd Python to navigate to it. What I can then do is type Jupyter Notebook, and it will open up a web browser. This should open up Jupyter in your default browser, and you will see a URL which looks something like this: localhost:8888/tree. And your browser should now have a list of files that look familiar. In fact, it will be the same structure as the folder you selected in your command prompt, which in my case was the Python folder. So it has all of these files in it. Now at this point, you're not actually running a notebook, you're just running the notebook server. So to create a notebook, all you need to do is click on the new button here, and it will open up a list of choices. Now on my machine, I only have Python 3 installed, so I can click on Python 3. If you had multiple kernels for other languages, you could select on one of these. But seeing as we're learning Python, Python 3 is exactly what we need. You will then be presented with a notebook that looks something like this. And you're going to become very familiar with this type of view because 90% of the course will use Jupyter Notebook. Now the first thing that may grab your attention is the name of the file. Currently at the top you can see that it says Untitled. Now this is the title for the page, and it's the name of your notebook. Untitled isn't a great name, so let's change it. Just move your mouse over the word Untitled and click on the text. You should then see an in-browser pop-up which says Rename Notebook. So we can type something like Jupyter Notebook Overview. When I click Rename, you can see our notebook is now set up and it's titled accordingly. So we're now at the point where we can start writing code into the notebook, and there are many hints and tips that I'm going to share with you in the next video that will make your experience working with Jupyter as smooth as possible. So I'll see you in the next video. Okay, so continuing from where we left off, we have a blank Jupyter notebook in which we can start writing code. And you'll notice that when we first go into a notebook, we get one empty cell that has this green box around it. We also have a flashing cursor, and also notice here that we have a little pencil symbol. What this means is that you're in an active cell, and this cell is ready to consume code. So just to verify that everything is working as it should, let's now add some Python code to this cell and then run its contents. So if I simply put print and put the string hello, and don't worry about this for now, we do cover everything in detail in the next section, we have now written some code in an active cell, but we haven't yet run the cell. Running a cell means that we execute the cell's contents. And to execute a cell, I can simply click on the run button within this toolbar and the cell will run. You can see that once I've clicked run, the cell is executed, a new code cell appears underneath in which we can write code, and our first line of code has the number 1 inside of square brackets. Now what this means is that this cell has completed running and it was the first cell that we run. If I now write another line of code in the cell underneath and write print goodbye, you can see that the second cell has now run. It has the number 2 inside because it's the second cell that was run in this notebook. And we've got another cell underneath in which we can start writing. Now you will have multiple cells in your notebook, and you would normally run the cells in order. But if I press the up arrow twice and go back to the very first code cell, and then run this cell again, you can now see that we have a 3 inside of the top cell, a 2 in the second cell, because the top cell is now the latest code cell to be run. Now if you didn't want to click on the run button, there are some shortcuts you can use to run code cells. You can simply press Ctrl and Enter, which will run the code cell and keep the code cell selected after it has been run. You can also press Shift and Enter when you're on a code cell, which will actually run the cell and then select the cell below. Or you can also press Alt and Enter, or on a Mac this will be Option and Enter, and this will run the cell and insert a new code cell below. So you have a few options here with respect to executing and running a specific code cell. Now we've seen that when you have a code cell selected, a green box appears around the outside, which means that you're in an active cell. Now if I press Escape, you will see that the code cell has a blue bar down the left hand side and the pencil symbol disappears. This essentially means I'm in command mode and I can now use the up and down arrows to navigate the code cells accordingly. Now when you're in command mode, there are 2 very useful keyboard shortcuts that I want to share. Let's suppose I want to put a piece of code in between the print hello statement and the print goodbye statement. If I have the very top cell selected, i.e. print hello, I can put a cell underneath this cell by pressing the B key on the keyboard. Now this needs to be done when I'm in command mode, i.e. when I have that blue bar on the left hand side. And the B essentially stands for below. Alternatively, if I go down to the print goodbye statement and then press the letter A on the keyboard, this will place a cell above the cell that you had selected. So B places a new code cell below, A places a new code cell above. If I want to delete a code cell, I can double tap the letter D on the keyboard and this will delete a cell in its entirety. Once again, this needs to be done when you're in the command mode, which is done by pressing the escape key. So 3 very common keyboard shortcuts that you'll no doubt use frequently. Now so far, we've been working within a cell type known as a code cell. And this can be seen within this drop-down menu here. It states code. And this means that we can write code in these cells, and when we execute them, they will be interpreted and run accordingly. But we also have a couple of other code cell types. In fact, there are 4 cell types that we can use. We can use code, markdown, raw NB convert, and heading. Now the heading cell type is actually no longer supported and will show you a message that states that. Now instead, you're supposed to use markdown for your headings. And the raw NB convert cell type is really only intended for special use cases, so we're not going to touch on this for now. So the other cell type that I want to introduce you to is the markdown cell type. Now we've already seen how the code cell works, so let's now learn how to style text by using the markdown cell type. So if I select a new code cell, by default we work with a code cell type, but to change this I can either select this drop down menu here, or when in command mode I can press the M on the keyboard. M stands for markdown. Now when I do this, you can see that the in and the square brackets on the left hand side of the cell disappears. This now means we're working within a markdown cell, and if I press return, we then can activate that cell, which then shows that green box and the pencil up here. I can then write some narrative text which helps supplement the notebook with additional information. For example, I could put, "This is some text." Now to execute this code cell, we run the exact same shortcuts as we learned previously, and you can then see that "this is some text" is displayed to the screen. Now Markdown is a markup language that is a superset of HTML. So if I now go back up to that Markdown cell and put an asterisk symbol before and after the word text, this will change the word text into italics. So we're even able to change the style of the Markdown that we write. And if you're familiar with HTML, we can utilize HTML tags. So if I wanted to convert the word text into a bold format, I can wrap this in a B tag like so. And if I also wanted to underline the now bold italic text, I can also wrap this in a U tag, which then underlines the text accordingly. Now Jupyter allows us to create headers in Markdown, which are very useful to segregate your notebook into neatly organized sections. All we have to do is ensure we are in a Markdown cell and then type the hash symbol with a space. So for example, if I put the hash symbol and then write header 1, you can see that we get a big bold header when we run the cell. Now the more hash symbols you use, the smaller the header becomes. So underneath header 1, if I were to write 2 hash symbols and then put header 2, and then underneath header 2 put 3 hash symbols and then header 3, you can even see a preview within the Markdown cell that hasn't been executed yet, but when I do execute this cell, you can see we end up with a nicely formatted header. Another thing you can do is create lists of bullet points, and you can do this by using dashes, plus signs, or asterisks. So for example, if I were to put an asterisk with a space and then put item 1, on the next line put a dash and a space, then put item 2, on the third line put a plus symbol and a space, and then put item 3, you can see that when I run this code cell, we get a list of 3 bullet points accordingly. Now we can also have sub items, so if I were to press the tab button and then put an asterisk and put sub item 1, you can see that we get a sub item accordingly with a different bullet point symbol. Now another great thing to note about Jupyter Notebook's Markdown capabilities is its syntax highlighting. Now if you want to insert a code example that you don't actually want your end users to run, i.e. you don't want it to be within a code cell, you can use Markdown to insert it. And the way we do this is by using inline code highlighting. To do this, all we need to do is surround the code with backticks. And all we need to use is triple backticks and then specify the programming language. So if I were to put to calculate 1 plus 1 in Python, all you need to do is, and then put a colon. On a new line I can then put 3 backticks. I can then put the programming language Python. On a new line I can then put the code that would need to be written in order to perform this calculation, so I could put print and then in brackets 1 plus 1. Underneath this I can close the 3 backticks, and then when I run this code cell you can see that we print the sentence accordingly, and then we get syntax highlighting with the exact code that would need to be written to print 1 plus 1 to the screen. A great way of being able to include syntax highlighting without your users having to run the actual code. Now within the menu bar there are many standard options that you'll be familiar with, having used many other pieces of software I'm sure. So you can create a new notebook, you can open the notebook, you can rename it. One thing to highlight is the ability to download as, so this enables you to export the notebook that you're currently working in, and you have a list of different formats that you can convert your notebook into. So you've got .py, you can convert it into an HTML file, and so on. You have the edit menu, which enables you to cut cells, copy cells, undo, delete cells, etc. So explore these in your own time. In the view menu you can toggle the header on and off, and you can toggle the toolbar on and off. which will provide you more space, but obviously you'll need to know some shortcuts if you do decide to toggle these off. We've seen how to insert cells above and below using the A and B letters on the keyboard. You can run cells using the cell menu. And one final thing to note here is that sometimes you may need to restart your kernel if, for example, you run into code that doesn't stop running. And this can happen, and we'll see this later in the course. So what this may mean is you need to come into kernel and then press on interrupt or restart in order to bring your notebook back to life. You can also restart and clear output, which will basically undo all the execution of your code cells, so you're back to square one. If you then want all of your code cells to run once your kernel has restarted, simply click on kernel and then restart and run all. So there you have it, Jupyter Notebook in a nutshell. Just like any application or program, you will become more comfortable using it the more you use it. Throughout the course, I will continue to showcase shortcuts and capabilities that Jupyter Notebook has to offer. But for now, this gives us the fundamental knowledge we need to get started with our Python learning. It's also worth noting that there are many cheat sheets available online. Just simply type Jupyter Notebook cheat sheet into Google and you'll be presented with many PDF files that contain the main shortcuts you need to operate efficiently in Jupyter. In the next section, we're going to focus on the most fundamental concepts in Python that will help tremendously in the subsequent sections. And these are things that you need to know before we dive into the more detailed aspects later on in the course. So I'll see you in the next section.